This is BBC World News. I'm Marianne Mashiri. Our top stories. The fight back begins. Donald Trump's lawyers have been setting out his defence in the impeachment trial, saying the president did nothing wrong.
They're asking you to remove President Trump from the ballot in an election that's occurring in approximately 9 months.
Well, this is the scene live in Washington on the 5th day of the impeachment hearings. China's President Xi Jinping says the spread of the coronavirus outbreak is speeding up and that his country is in a grave situation. The virus has killed at least 41 people in China. Cases have been reported in Europe, the US, and countries in the Asia-Pacific region. A search for survivors in Turkey after a powerful earthquake kills at least 21 people. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. Let's head straight to Washington now and show you live pictures of where lawyers representing President Trump have been setting out their defence of him in his impeachment trial. These are the live pictures from the US Senate after 3 days of arguments from Democrat politicians. Today has been the turn of the president's lawyers to put the case for their client. Now, they've sought to pretty much demolish claims from the Democrats that President Trump pressured Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden, a political rival. Now, I can tell you they've just adjourned, I'm not sure for how long. So let's have a bit of a look back at what we've heard so far. The head of President Trump's defense team, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, said in his opening remarks that the impeachment attempt posed a danger to American democracy.
They're asking you not only to overturn the results of the last election, but as I've said before, they're asking you to remove President Trump from the ballot in an election that's occurring in approximately 9 months. They're asking you to tear up all of the ballots across this country on your own initiative. Take that decision away from the American people. And I don't think they spent 1 minute of their 24 hours talking to you about the consequences of that for our country. Not 1 minute.
Well, the defence also made the argument that the Democrats' case relies heavily on hearsay rather than explicit evidence of quid pro quo.
This case is really not about presidential wrongdoing. This entire impeachment process is about the House manager's insistence that they are able to read everybody's thoughts, they can read everybody's intention, even when the principal speakers, the witnesses themselves, insist that those interpretations are wrong.
Arguing against the second article of the impeachment, obstruction of Congress, saying that Congress has failed to follow legal precedent in their requests for information.
In every instance, when there was resistance to a subpoena for a witness or for documents, there was a legal explanation of the justification for it. For example, they focused a lot on an October 8th letter from the counsel to the president, Pat Cipollone, but they didn't show you an October 18th letter, which is up on the screen now, that went through in detail why subpoenas that had been issued by Manager Schiff's committees were invalid because the House has not authorized your committees to conduct any such inquiry or to subpoena information in furtherance of it. And that was because the House had not taken a vote to authorize the committee to exercise the power of impeachment to issue any compulsory process.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Michael Goldfarb. He's an American author, journalist and broadcaster.
The most important thing for world viewers to understand about this is that although the language and structure is legal. It's not really a legal procedure. It's very much a political procedure. The whole idea of impeachment was put in to the American Constitution because the people who wrote the Constitution back in 1787 were concerned. What happens if you get a chief executive who wants to act like a monarch? Well, how do you remove him? Well, you have this thing called high crimes and misdemeanors, and bribery and treason are the four ways to do it, but then they offer no format for it. They just simply say, well, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will oversee a trial in the Senate, but there are no rules. So the rules are made up each time. There haven't been that many. The rules are made up. And what they're trying to do is saying, in the opening arguments by the lead lawyer, Pat Cipollone, he said, you're trying to undo the results of the election. It's kind of an echo of one of the arguments that you heard during the imbroglio about Brexit. Should we have a second referendum? Well, you're trying to undo.
So they're trying to make this more about America as a whole rather than about President Trump. Exactly.
But, you know, the point is that the founders of America knew that this would be an argument used against it, but they decided, look, if you have an egregious example, then the Congress has to have some mechanism to call the chief executive up. And that's why they're doing this.
But then the system only works if you have the vote, it's 2/3 majority. But how can that happen?
Well, it's not going to happen.
If you have a majority.
And that's why this is an
especially. This is skewed, isn't it?
This is an especially political process. Because, I mean, the Senate Majority Leader, the Republican Mitch McConnell, a couple of weeks ago said that his mind's already made up. Well, if it's a real jury, anyone who's ever done jury service knows that you're supposed to hear the evidence with an open mind. Their minds are already made up. So it's become very much a political process. And the question is, why would the Democrats do it? So the question, there's three main reasons. First is, if they don't, then a precedent has been set for the next president who wants to expand presidential power and become more autocratic. And, you know, you have to say, well, you know, you're going to go through this if you try this. I mean, his advisors should be able to say that. So that's a precedent for the future.
That's Michael Goldfarb. Let's talk now to our Washington correspondent, Chris Buckler. And Chris, talk me through what you think the highlights were, if you like, of the Republicans and their case in the defence of President Trump.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there was a very methodical attempt to go through some of the Democrats' arguments and to rebut them. And it was, in many ways, a bit like a trial. They took the arguments the Democrats had set out and essentially said when President Trump looked like the bad guy in these Democratic arguments, he was actually the good guy. So essentially the Democrats say he was trying to use his position to basically benefit himself. Actually, their argument is he was trying to address corruption. He was concerned about corruption in other countries and basically painting him as the good guy rather than the Democrats' bad guy. But actually, you got a sense, I suppose, of what is to come in those opening arguments and some of what you were just reflecting on there, that this is a deeply political trial. Yes, impeachments are not like a criminal trial. They are a political trial. But in this case, it is all deeply political. And in those arguments that this isn't about the Democrats concerned about the conduct of a president in office, it's much more about the vote that put him into office in the first place. They say, this is the Donald Trump's legal team, that the Democrats are trying to rewrite the election that took place in 2016, but also they are doing their best to try and influence the election that is coming only a matter of months away in November 2020. That is when Donald Trump will stand for re-election as the United States president. And you got the real idea that despite this very lawyerly way of going about making their arguments, that there was also that political message that was being put to the American public. And remember, this is being televised. This is being televised across the US. They are speaking not just to the senators who will act as the jurors in this case, they are also speaking to the American public.
And Chris, of course, those senators that you talk about, how likely is it, if at all, that this evidence is going to cause either Republicans or Democrats to cross the aisle, if you like, and vote with the others?
Well, we've said time and time again, it needs 2/3 of a majority to remove a president from office. And frankly, given that the Republicans have a simple majority, that just seems impossible. It's not going to happen. But it's relatively tight. There's about 53 Republicans and then 47 who sit in the Democratic caucus. And if you take a look at the Democrats, they are doing their very best to appeal to a handful of moderates who they believe could influence another vote that is likely to take place. And that is about introducing witnesses, calling witnesses to come and give evidence in this trial. Now, that has been blocked by Republicans so far. But the Democrats believe if they can get a few Republicans to even vote on that issue, that witnesses should be called, that it could really help their case. And again, that is about appealing to the American public as well as senators, suggesting that President Trump had done something wrong. As for the president himself, it seems likely that he is watching things in the White House because he's been tweeting and encouraging his supporters to tune in to America's news networks who have been televising all of this. He's also been slightly more restrained than his legal team in attacking the Democrats, at one stage describing some of those who have been leading this impeachment process as liars and cheaters.
Chris Buckler, thank you very much. Now, China's President Xi Jinping has said the new virus is accelerating its spread, putting the country in a grave situation. His comments came as officials in Beijing confirmed the number of people known to have died from the coronavirus outbreak has now reached 41. The number of cases is now put at 1,372, and the virus is continuing to spread around the world. Malaysia has just confirmed its first cases of the virus, along with Australia. It's also been reported in Europe for the first time, with 3 cases confirmed in France, and the UK is currently screening for suspected cases. Chinese authorities are looking to reassure the public. These pictures of military personnel being deployed to help overwhelmed medical staff cope with an influx of potential patients were shown on state-run news channels. Well, our China correspondent Stephen McDonnell is near Wuhan, where the virus was first detected. He posted this video of being screened at a check post close to the border with Hubei, where he and his colleagues had their temperatures checked before being allowed to proceed. He also sent us a report once he arrived in the province.
The authorities are starting to lock down this entire province of nearly 60 million people where the coronavirus emergency began. Hospitals in Wuhan have been overwhelmed with the sick. State media has reported that one doctor treating people with the virus has died. Military medics have been flown in to help with the crisis, as have specialist doctors from Shanghai. But the challenge remains considerable, with the infection rate ever on the increase. This is Hubei province, where this virus emergency started. As you can see, it's pretty quiet on the first day of the year of the rat. All these shops are closed. There's pretty much nobody on the street here. Those who are out in the streets are wearing masks, and you can understand why. People are very worried, and people just don't know for how long it's going to be like this, for how long they have to stay indoors or risk being infected with this potentially deadly coronavirus which causes pneumonia.
That's Steve McDonnell there. Let's talk now to Dr. Tom Fletcher, a consultant and senior clinical lecturer at the Liverpool School for Tropical Medicine. Let me ask you first of all, thanks for joining us, how worried are you about the coronavirus?
I'm pretty worried. I think, as you've heard from the President of China and also the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, this is an emergency going on within China, and these numbers are increasing almost hour by hour, and there's clearly significant evidence of human-to-human transmission of this virus in China.
How easy is it for this virus to be transmitted from one person to another?
Well, we're only just starting to understand much more about this virus. We can draw similarities from previous coronavirus outbreaks such as SARS from a previous region, but it looks as though this virus is transmitting human to human relatively easily. A key figure we talk about in this world is what's called the R0. So if I had this infection, how many people would I go on to infect? And there's quite big predictions about what that might be for this virus yet, up to 4, but a more sensible figure at the moment is possibly about 2.
And does that mean then that it's more likely to be spread around the world as people with it travel everywhere?
Well, we have seen that already in terms of obviously cases that have been exported out of China into a significant number of countries. And that's partly clearly what has informed the restriction of movement that's been put in place around these cities in China. I guess what I would say is of the countries that have received cases now, they have good public health infrastructure. They have the ability to identify these cases, isolate them and treat them appropriately, which means that risk in those countries is much less.
So what about China then? What do you think needs to happen to contain what could potentially be, as the president described, a grave situation for the country?
Sure. So there's a huge range of public health measures that are going on within China, and the main driver is trying to stop this virus passing from human to human and trying to reduce that rate of infection of not infecting less than 1 people and bringing the epidemic under control. So that is everything from having the right triage and surveillance activities, to be able to pick up cases when they have a fever if they've been in contact, then the ability to test them, to isolate them, and then to treat them. And then as you sort of seen and highlighted, other measures have been put in place which are rather more drastic in terms of restriction of movement. But another key thing is they have to keep the population on board. So a key part of this outbreak will be maintaining the compliance and ensuring that the community is mobilized to support the outbreak. The other area that mustn't be forgotten is the healthcare workers, as you highlighted in your report. A significant number are now heading towards Wuhan and other areas to try to look after patients. And we know, unfortunately, whenever these outbreaks occur of these type of viruses, often those infections then can spread within hospitals, both to medical staff but also to other patients. So it's vitally important that those healthcare workers are protected, and that is challenging.
I've seen a few people actually in London, and obviously loads of people in China wearing face masks. How effective are these masks?
I think it's difficult to say, to be honest. That's clearly a decision that's been made by China to try and reduce this community transmission of virus between people. The evidence for that isn't really there in terms of in the community setting, because often the masks aren't necessarily the right ones. People in the community don't wear them sort of appropriately, and they have to be changed quite regularly. We know that in a hospital it's quite different. So if I'm trying to protect myself from a patient with one of these conditions, we wear slightly different masks often and are obviously trained how to wear that.
OK, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher, for talking to us. Do stay with us here on BBC World News, because still to come, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan visits the province worst hit by Friday's earthquake to meet victims and rescue workers.
The shuttle Challenger exploded soon after liftoff. There were 7 astronauts on board, one of them a woman schoolteacher. All of them are believed to have been killed.
By the evening, Tahrir Square, the heart of official Cairo, was in the hands of the demonstrators. They were using the word revolution.
The earthquake singled out buildings and brought them down in seconds. Tonight, the search for any survivors has an increasing desperation about it as the hours passed.
The new government is firmly in control of the entire Republic of Uganda.
Survivors of the Auschwitz concentration camp have been commemorating the 40th anniversary of their liberation. They toured the huts, gas chambers and crematoria and relived their horrifying experiences.
This is BBC World News. These are the latest headlines. Lawyers representing Donald Trump have begun their defence in his impeachment trial, saying the president had done nothing wrong. Well, let's get more on the story. I'm joined now by the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, Michael Isikoff. Thank you so much for joining us here on BBC World News, Michael. First of all, I assume you've been watching very closely the goings-on over the past few days, in particular today. What do you make of the president's defence so far?
Well, it was not nearly as rousing and as masterful as we heard from the House Democratic managers, particularly Chief Manager Schiff, who really did a bang-up job and spoke for hours on end in, at times, impassioned advocacy. This was the first presentation by the president's lawyers. It was much much more low-key, a bit scattershot, but they did score a few points, make a few points that will probably help them. Remember, the burden for the president's lawyers here is pretty low. They don't have to prove the case. They just have to pick enough holes in the Democrats' case to give Republicans who do control the Senate confidence enough that they can acquit the president. And I think that they were somewhat successful on a couple of points, particularly the burden sharing argument. Remember, the guts of the Democrats' case is that the president was pressuring the Ukrainians and withheld the aid solely to get these investigations into the Bidens and supposed 2016 interference. And the president's lawyers pointed out that before on that famous July 25th call, before the president even raised the issue of the Bidens or Ukrainian interference, he was talking about burden sharing, about how Angela Merkel talks about aiding Ukraine, but she doesn't do anything. European countries aren't doing enough. And that's the public policy reasons that the president's lawyers are going to say was behind the withholding of military aid.
So by saying that, look, this is just the way that President Trump conducts his foreign policy, is that going to wash, do you think, with everyone?
Well, remember, the audience here, the most immediate audience, is the Republicans in the Senate. We know how the Democrats are going to vote. They're all going to vote for conviction. Actually, there's probably a couple, Manchin in West Virginia, Doug Jones in Alabama, who have a tougher vote, but the expectation is the Democrats are going to vote for conviction. The expectation is most Republicans are going to vote for conviction. There's a couple of moderate Republicans in the middle who have said they wanted to hear the evidence to make a decision, particularly on that crucial vote next week about whether to call witnesses. And that's really the only audience here that matters in the immediate term. There's the broader public, American public, and that's going to play out over many, many months during an election campaign. But most immediately, there's moderate Republicans, some of whom said they were turned off at the end by a couple of comments that Adam Schiff made last night. They've got the president's lawyers have an opening here to score some points with them. That's who these arguments have to wash with.
Okay, Michael Isikoff, it's so good to have your analysis. Thank you so much.
Sure enough.
Rescue workers in eastern Turkey are continuing to search for survivors after an earthquake killed at least 22 people and left more than 900 injured. The 6.8 magnitude earthquake, which centred on the town of Sivrice in Elazığ province, caused buildings to collapse and was felt in neighbouring countries. Sylvia Lennon-Spence reports.
Devastation in the small Turkish town of Sivrice as apartment blocks lie in ruins after Friday night's powerful earthquake. The 6.8 magnitude quake struck just before 9 p.m. local time, taking residents by surprise.
We were watching television, then all of a sudden there was an earthquake and it shook hard and the floor collapsed. So we went to the window and, well, after we found a way out, we broke the door and got out, and as we did, we saw that other houses had collapsed too.
Hundreds of aftershocks followed the main tremor, which was also felt in neighbouring Syria, Lebanon and Iran. Rescue teams are still searching for survivors in collapsed buildings. Moments of jubilation as survivors are pulled from the rubble. But many more are still missing.
According to the first damage assessments, it was seen that 5 buildings in total had collapsed, and there are several other heavily damaged structures. Our teams are doing damage assessments rapidly.
Turkey lies on major fault lines and is prone to frequent earthquakes. Around 17,000 people died in a massive quake in 1999. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said all steps were being taken to help those affected by the quake. But here in Elazığ province, hopes remain of finding people alive. This woman was rescued safely after 17 hours under the rubble. Sylvia Lennon-Spence, BBC News.
Absolutely incredible pictures there. And of course, if you want to know more on what is happening in Turkey in the aftermath of that devastating earthquake, do go to our website. It's bbc.com/news. Before I leave you, though, a reminder of our top story. It's making news everywhere as top story. The lawyers representing Donald Trump have begun in earnest their defense of the US president today in his impeachment trial in the Senate in front of senators from both the Democratic and the Republican Party. We've heard them talking about his defense in particular. They've said the president has done nothing wrong. They said the Democrats in the Senate are politically motivated, and also that they have not shown that he has abused his power. They also said that Mr. Trump's accusers had left out pretty important evidence and called the impeachment trial the most serious interference in an election in US history. We've heard from various lawyers, both his own White House lawyers and his outside White House lawyers, who are outlining the case that they will bring forward in the next few days. And of course, you'll hear all of that case here on BBC World News. Do stay with us. Thank you so much for your company. Bye-bye.